So with these biotic diseases, first I'm just going to talk about some of these very general diseases that a lot of plants tend to get. And if we start from the bottom, crown, root, and stem rots can affect pretty much every plant that's out there. They can have some sort of rot that occurs either in the roots, right at the crown, or lower stem that and moves up. And as you can see on these pictures, we have some healthy leaves, or this top picture, we have some healthy roots right next to some very rotted roots. And then if you look at the split tomato plants, you can see that the second tomato plant in there, where it's been split, the inside of the vascular tissue is just brown or discolored, a sure sign that there's a crown or stem rot going on. And these are our biotic diseases. So crown and stem rots, again, most plants are susceptible to them, and they can be caused by quite a few different types of soil microbes. So there are some oomycetes, the water molds as we tend to think of them. Those are Pythium and Phytophthora are the main oomycetes that will cause damping off, or these crown and root rots. Some of the primary fungi that cause these diseases will be Fusarium or Rhizoctonia. We can also have bacteria that cause these crown, root, and stem rots as well. And a lot of those bacteria will be in the genus Erwinia or Pseudomonas. And so just some general symptoms when we do have some sort of crown rot or crown or stem rot is a discoloration of the plant. And as we look further up the plant towards the top portions, we may just see some general wilting, or the plants just look a little bit flaccid. They don't look healthy. But there's not actually an issue that's going on the top part of the plants. That wilting or flaccid look is all due to the plant not being able to uptake nutrients the way that it should. Also, if you see any sort of dark brown or black kind of water-soaked lesions that are right around the soil line and extend up, or if they're on the roots, again, that's a sure sign of crown or root rot. And another thing that I like to do is anytime a sample comes into the clinic, I like to smell it. Surprisingly enough, different diseases do smell a little bit differently. And so if I have a plant that is infected with Pythium and it's been in an enclosed Ziploc bag overnight, if I open that bag and stick my nose in there, it's going to have a bit of a fishy odor to it. And so if you notice a bit of a fishy odor, you may have Pythium. Again, that's general rule of thumb, not always the case. Or if you're smelling it and it's just kind of smells sickly sweet, often that's going to be a soft rot or one of your bacterial issues. So the Erwinia or Pseudomonas. As far as management of these diseases, first and foremost, plant-resistant varieties if you can. A lot of the varieties that we have out there, they will be more or less susceptible to the different crown and stem rots. Also, crop rotation or plant rotation plays a really big role in managing some of these rots of the lower plant. If you're planting tomatoes in the same area year after year, eventually you're going to have some issues occur. So we like to recommend doing about a 3 to 5 year rotation for your garden or your landscape, the annuals in your landscape, just so you're not building up a certain pathogen in an area. Also, a lot of these pathogens, they need free moisture or an excess amount of moisture in order to infect. So anything that you can do that would improve drainage tends to affect our crown and root rots. As with most diseases, try to remove infected material as soon as you see it. And with these, you want to make sure to remove the entire plant, including the root ball for it. Chemical treatments of crown and root rots, we typically don't recommend, primarily because they can be fairly expensive and they often require repeat applications. Another thing with a lot of these crown and root rots is if it's say you have a rhubarb, stand of rhubarb or something like that you have a soft rot in, you may think, well, I'll just go and transplant that to another area where we don't have this bacteria. Unfortunately, anytime you transplant something, you're going to be moving some of that soil along with it, and that soil can then harbor some of those crown rot pathogens as well. Next is powdery mildew. Powdery mildew tends to just be a superficial white or kind of gray growth over the surface of leaves, stems, fruits, and flowers. Typically, powdery mildew is caused by a very host-specific fungi. So the powdery mildew that affects your lilacs should not affect your turf or any of your peonies, anything like that. And powdery mildew it's a very environmentally dependent pathogen. So it needs moderate temperatures, but also it needs high humidity and poor air circulation. High humidity and poor air circulation typically go hand in hand. And so if you're able to do anything that can improve air circulation or decrease humidity in an area, hopefully that will decrease the amount of powdery mildew that you have. Here we have powdery mildew of roses, and you can see just the superficial growth, white growth on the leaves, but also on some of the flowers. And powdery mildew of roses. This one likes rainfall and temperatures in the 70s to 80s. Again, typical of most of our powdery mildews. Also, if we have low daytime humidity followed by high nighttime humidity, that can really increase the amount of powdery mildew that we have as well. So as the temperatures drop at night and the humidity increases, again, that's just a perfect storm for powdery mildew. And even though it is just a lot of superficial growth, those plants are not able to photosynthesize as well as they would be able to without that growth on there, and that just depletes their overall nutrients. And here we just have another picture of powdery mildew on some roses. This is powdery mildew on Kentucky bluegrass. Completely different fungus than the powdery mildew of roses, but the same sort of things apply. Increased humidity, decreased airflow is when we tend to see powdery mildew on turf. And if one were to bring a sample of powdery mildew into the plant and pest diagnostic clinic and we look at it underneath the scope, the white cottony growth that we see is actually just these chains of fungal spores that are growing. And this is what the spores look like underneath a scope. So as far as controlling powdery mildew, again, if you have a resistant variety available, recommend doing that resistant variety. Also, sanitation is very important. Make sure to remove or rake up any infected leaves. If you can improve air circulation, that's great. If you can increase sun exposure, that's going to be great as well. Another thing that you can do is thin your plants. And so if you have a really heavy stand, if you have a lot of peonies in the area, maybe go ahead and thin out every third or fourth peony to increase airflow through there, and that may decrease the amount of powdery mildew that you have. And in cases that, in severe cases, there are some protective fungicide sprays that are effective. Bordeaux's mixture, some of these copper-based products effectively control powdery mildew as well. One of the next common diseases that we get is anthracnose. And so for every plant that's out there, there is a type of anthracnose that can affect it. Similar to powdery mildew, most of the anthracnose diseases are caused by a very host-specific fungi. So the anthracnose of your pepper will not be the same anthracnose on turf. Anthracnose, in addition to affecting the leaves or the fruit, we may also just see it on the stems. And so there will just be these black lesions that form on the stems. A sure sign of anthracnose. And as far as managing for it, Now, if you can plant disease-free plants is a good one. So if you are doing transplants, you'll want to make sure that there's not some anthracnose on there already. Okay. So question is, can you safely compost plants that are infected with powdery mildew? The answer is it depends. If you are one of the 0.001% of home composters that do proper composting, you'll probably be okay. I am yet to see a home compost pile that's been done properly, though. And if you're not reaching those temperatures, then you're not able to properly do it. And I do have a little bit more on composting and disposal of diseased tissue later on, so we'll discuss that. So moving back to management of anthracnose on some of our fruits. One thing is not to let that fruit over-ripen. As the fruit over-ripens, now you're just waiting. It's no longer able to fend off a lot of the fungal pathogens, and the anthracnose can really take over. Minimize your overhead irrigation. A lot of the anthracnose fungi they survive in the soil. Overhead irrigation tends to help that soil splash up, and then those spores can now infect the infected higher leaves. Similar to that, you'll want to water early in the day. If you water early in the day, you now have all day to let the sun kind of bake off a lot of the moisture that's going to be on the leaves. Without that period of leaf wetness, you're not going to have near as much infection. Mulching with straw instead of plastic tends to really decrease the amount of anthracnose. And again, if you see some infected plant parts, go ahead and remove them. So if you have a few leaves that are infected or some fruits that are infected, remove those as soon as you see it. That will just decrease the amount of anthracnose spores that will be available. So I've been talking about anthracnose on some gardens plants, but we also get anthracnose on pretty much every other plant. We tend to got a lot of calls with anthracnose on some trees last year. It can infect sycamores, ashes, oaks, maples, walnuts, poplars. Like I said, most plants, there is a type of anthracnose that can infect them. And with trees, we tend to see a worse anthracnose in years where we have an extended bud break period. And so if you think about the weather last season, it was or at least in Lincoln, it was pretty cool in the early spring, and then it just stayed cool for quite a few weeks. And that's right as a lot of the trees were starting to, as the buds were starting to break, that increased moisture and cooler temperatures during that bud break period really increased the amount of anthracnose that was able to infect the trees. And typically, with anthracnose, a lot of the lesions will be along the veins. And so, as you see the top picture of the maple leaf that we have there, you see that a lot of the lesions do tend to originate at the veins and spread out. Pretty typical of anthracnose. And if you have it year after year, eventually it can cause the shoots or twigs to die. But the fungi overwinter on infected twigs and small branches for trees. Typically, if you have a mature tree, it's going to be pretty difficult for any of those soil fungi to get up into the tree. And the symptoms tend to appear following a cool, wet weather in spring. But it's talked about anthracnose on vegetables, on trees. Turf will get anthracnose as well. Pretty much every turf species that we have can get anthracnose, and so again, you may tend to see it on turf. But just general control of anthracnose. Again, plant-resistant varieties if you're able to. Remove any infected tissue, so rake up and destroy that infected tissue. Or if you have to prune out the infected tissue, go ahead and do that. During periods that are excessively dry, make sure that you're watering adequately and providing some mulch. And anthracnose is one of those fungi that really tends to take off on plants that have additional stresses. And so if they're already drought stressed or moisture stressed, they're going to be much more susceptible to anthracnose. And if you need to, protective fungicide sprays are possible. So if you have working with trees, applying a fungicide kind of right during that bud break period, that can provide some pretty good control of it. Unfortunately, with trees though, we typically don't see anthracnose until the leaves have fully expanded. Once the leaves are out, you can spray gallons of that fungicide on there and it's not going to do anything. All right, so I guess, are there any more questions about what I've discussed, these kind of common diseases that affect all sorts of plants? Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So that's a really good question. So the question that we got was, if you have an infected plant, is any of the fruit going to be safe to eat? And the answer is it really depends on the pathogen, or it depends on what's going on. If you have some virus issues in tomatoes, typically those tomatoes are still going to taste fine. The tomatoes may be a little bit deformed, they may have some rings on them, but taste-wise, they'll be okay and they won't harm you at all. So typically, a lot of the plant pathogens that we have cannot infect humans or animals or anything like that. However, there are some fungal diseases that will produce some mycotoxins. And so a lot of fungi are really good at producing secondary compounds that may be antimicrobial or have some other effects to them. Fusarium is one of those really common soil-borne fungi, and that one is known to produce mycotoxins. Now, just because you have fusarium that's affected your tomato stand, does that mean they're not safe to eat? You know, generally, I would say if the fruit looks okay, you're probably going to be okay to eat it. Okay. So one of the questions is, if you have a history of a disease, should you automatically spray in the spring? My answer for that is it depends. And so a lot will depend on what is the disease. And also how long have you been dealing with it? The other thing that you'll want to think about is, what is the environment doing? Are we projected to have a very wet year or a really dry year? If it's going to be a wet year, then maybe you'll want to go ahead and do some of those protective fungicide sprays. Otherwise, if the forecast is for a fairly dry year, you might be able to get away without doing one of those fungicide sprays. But typically, if it's a high value plant, whether economically high value, emotionally high value, you'll want to do something to save it, and then you may want to look at a preventative fungicide spray. So green beans have white on them later in the season. Is it powdery mildew? Very possibly. A lot will depend on kind of what the environmental conditions that the green beans are grown in is like. If it's an area that's going to have a lot of humidity, not a whole lot of sunlight, not a whole lot of airflow, then I would say, yeah, there's a pretty good chance that it is green bean, or that it's powdery mildew. Other thing is it could be there are a few other fungal pathogens that can affect green beans that hit them later in the season. White mold is one of them, and that will show up as kind of white cottony growth on the plants as well. Oh, awesome. Well, thank you, Scotts Bluff. Did my job. So the question was about preventative measures for trees that have frost crack. And I would just say anything that you can do that would increase overall health of that tree. And so if there's not a good mulch layer around the tree, go ahead and apply some mulch there. That would be a good one. Another good preventative measure for that would be making sure that in the fall, before the trees are going dormant, that you're making sure that these trees are getting a good fall watering before they go dormant. That can really increase the overall viability of the trees throughout the winter. Anything else? Oh, and I guess tree wrap would work as well for frost crack.